manuscripts differ so widely from one another. This is a case in point.
So if Codex Bezae adds all sorts of commentary, the number of steps Paul stepped down, the time frame when he lectured in Acts, all these things are added. Why wouldn't it be more likely, given that there is no earlier manuscript support for that reading, that the writer of Codex D saw the very same strong language that you yourself have pointed to in your argumentation? He casts him out, he strongly upbraids him, and made a change, as he did in so many other places in his writing.
Well, that's a standard argument. That's what people have said for years, and I disagree with it. I think that, in fact, on internal grounds, there are solid reasons for thinking that it was Orgus Theis. My principal reasoning has nothing to do with the value of Codex Bezae, as you probably know. I mean, you've read my articles on it, so I assume you've read my article on Mark 141.
I have.
So that it's not. I mean, Codex Bezae is, to some extent, neither here nor there. It provides us with the reading, but it isn't the strong argument for the reading being original.
Okay, and would that be one of the readings that you feel changes the entire meaning of a book?
Well, no, I wouldn't put it that way with that reading. I would say that reading provides a different nuance. Jesus gets angry a couple of times in the Gospel of Mark, and it's interesting to try and see why he gets angry in the Gospel of Mark, and this would be another place where he gets angry in Mark. I mean, it struck most scribes as a little bit odd for him to get angry at this point. And this leper comes up and wants to be healed, and it says Jesus got angry. And so, that's a little hard to figure out. No wonder they changed it to he felt compassion for the man. I mean, it makes sense that they would make the change. But in fact, it probably said he got angry. And then the task of the exegete, the interpreter, is to try and make sense of why it is. Now it says that Jesus got angry when this leper approached him. And so it changes the meaning of the book to the extent that it gives you a fuller understanding of why Jesus gets angry in the Gospel of Mark. By the way, he doesn't get angry in Matthew or Luke.
When you repeatedly say that we don't know what the original writings of the New Testament said, given that there are entire sections of text where there is no variation basically at all, would you agree that we know what those sections of the New Testament said?
Okay, let me explain why, because I don't think I've explained it very well. Let's say Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians, and they got a copy. And then somebody made a copy of that original, and made a couple mistakes. And then somebody copied that copy, made a few mistakes. And then the original was lost, and the first copy was lost. And that all other manuscripts ultimately derive from that third copy. In other words, that third copy was, the original wasn't copied anymore, the first copy wasn't copied anymore, only the second copy was copied twice, and both of those was copied 5 times, and each of those was copied 20 times, and so they all go back in a genealogical line to the third copy rather than to the original. All you can reconstruct is what was in the third copy. And all manuscripts, when they agree, 95% of the time, or whatever number you want to put on it, when they agree 95% of the time, that just shows that they all go back to that copy. It doesn't show they go back to the original.
And so this kind of perspective, I want to make sure that we're all understanding exactly what you're saying. This is why you would say that if anything was ever inspired, in essence, we'd have to have the original for it to be inspired.
No, I told you long ago that this was not going to be a debate about my doctrine of inspiration. I'm not saying anything has to be one way or the other. God could have inspired the originals and then decided to allow scribes to change the originals. God could have inspired all the textual variants. I mean, if you're saying if it's impossible, then when you're talking about God, nothing is impossible. The church father Origen maintained that all of the textual variants were inspired by God, that he inspired the scribes. So, well, that's perfectly fine if that's what you want to think. I simply don't think so. My view is that if God wanted us to have his words, he wouldn't have allowed his words to be changed so that we don't know what the words were.
So the standard then that would have to exist for you to have maintained the position that you held would have been either the originals or some perfect copy thereof.
Why would God not allow the originals to be preserved? I used to ask myself that question. I mean, if he inspired Mark to write down this book, why wouldn't he let it? I mean, it wouldn't be impossible for it to be preserved. There are other books that are preserved that long. Why wouldn't he tell Christians, keep that book so that you have something to judge the copies by? But he didn't do that. We don't have the original. So it made me suspect that maybe God wasn't that interested in giving us his words. If he was, why didn't he give them to us? That was my question.
So clearly that's not the perspective of the apostles themselves, who themselves did not have access to any originals of the Old Testament, and yet they quoted freely from the Old Testament based upon even translations of the Old Testament.
That's
so
right. It was not their view.
I'm sorry?
That's
is
right.
not their
view. It was not their view, no.
Right. So as you are thinking about this, then...
I should say, though, when they quote the Old Testament, it's a very interesting thing because they quote it in different forms, and in the form they quote it often is not the form that we have it. Matthew, for example, quotes the Old Testament sometimes. He'll give a quotation of Scripture that you can't find in the Bible. Why is that? Because he had a different form than we have.
So to apply your standard then, how could there have been any revelation given without the ability for perfect copying down through the ages?
It didn't have to be perfectly copied. God could have just preserved the originals.
So if there is any claimed scripture from antiquity that does not have the originals, the Quran has textual variation in it, that can't possibly come from God then?
I'm not drawing that theological conclusion, and I don't really appreciate you likening me to a Muslim.
I didn't.
Both in your speech and just now. I'm not making any stand about the Quran. I don't know anything about the Quran. I'm simply making a very basic point, and I'm not making this as a normative point for everybody. I'm saying for me, it doesn't make sense to say that God inspired the words because he wanted us to have his words if he didn't give us his words. We don't have his words because the originals don't exist and accurate copies don't exist. There are places where we don't know what the originals even said.
So your standard for accurate copy is perfection, is it not?
Perfection.
Yes, sir.
I think if I copy the word ego, and instead of writing ego, I write autos, then in fact, that is an imperfect copy. A perfect copy would be a copy that copied ego as ego.